Where's my seat? Okay, there it is. Okay. Good. All right. Okay. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody this evening? Good? Still smells like lilacs out there, so it's pretty good. Okay, I have to do a little bit of housekeeping again this week. We have no program next Monday because it's Memorial Day, but we do have a Thursday night program, June 1st, 7 p.m. We have journalist Jan Brogan, who will present The Combat Zone, Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice. This is an account of how the 1976 murder of a Harvard student in the then red light district of Boston and the two trials that followed reverberated across the city, the state, and the nation. So you have to come to that. Volunteers. If you can bake desserts, if you can take admission at the door, if you can work a website, if you are at all talented as a graphic artist, or even if you're not particularly talented, please see me. Sponsors, always needed. We have so many great sponsors this year, and I'm so appreciative. But we could always use more. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to thank the sponsors of this program, Mr. and Mrs. Anonymous. So you know who you are, and you know that we appreciate you. So tonight we are honored to have with us a former trustee of Tales of Cape Cod, the past president of West Barnstable Historical Society, trustee of West Parish Memorial Foundation, a member of Barnstable's 350th Anniversary Committee, and chair of the Town Poor Farm Study Committee, amongst other titles. James Ellis served in the Air Force during the Korean War and graduated from Michigan State University. My son-in-law would not appreciate that. He's from the University of Michigan. Before turning to writing, Mr. Ellis headed the crime analysis unit of the St. Louis Police Department and headed the planning bureau of the Massachusetts State Police. He also worked in management positions at U.S. Justice, Treasury, and Labor Departments, and was appointed New England Regional Director of the Department of the Interior. He is the author of several books, one of which he has brought with him tonight, and is a frequent contributor to periodicals and professional journals. And tonight, he is speaking to all of us, about the luminaries of West Barnstable: Otis, Warren, Percival, and Shaw. I'm very pleased to present James Ellis.
I don't think I need that.
All right. You want to stand for my?
Yep.
Okay. Should I?
Thank you. From time to time, people ask me, how did I get an idea for the books that I write? This particular book, Luminaries of West Barnstable, traces really back to my college days in Michigan. I was attending a class on criminal law, and the subject this day was search and seizure. And Professor Houts talked at great length on something called the writs of assistance. The writs of assistance were general search warrants that the Crown used to check for untaxed goods making their way into the colonies. And it became just one of the tools that Great Britain used to, in a sense, harass the merchants of the colonies. Boston merchants didn't like this, and they took suit against the Crown. Interestingly, there was a man who was Advocate General of the Vice Admiralty. His job would have been to defend the writs of assistance. But he resigned his position, and he took the side of the merchants. After discussing the merits of writs of assistance, Professor Houts turned to the class and said, "Now, who was that man who argued for the merchants?" I raised my hand and said, "James Otis, Jr." Professor Houts was stunned. For semester after semester, way out in Michigan, he had asked this question and nobody ever knew the answer. Well, of course I knew the answer. I was born a half a mile from the birthplace of James Otis. He wasn't a stranger to me. In any event, when I got back on spring break, I went to visit my grandfather, Henry Ellis, who incidentally was one of the original founders of Tales of Cape Cod. He was a prominent lawyer in Hyannis and an avid student of history, U.S. history, Cape history, and the like. And he made a point that stuck with me after I told him this tale. He was amused by it, but he said, "You know, there isn't a village in the country that has made more of a contribution to the country's leadership than Little West Barnstable." And that stuck with me. After a couple of years, I wrote a newspaper magazine article on the subject. And when the town was getting ready to celebrate its 375th anniversary in 2014, I thought this would be a good time for a book on the subject. And that's how the book originated. But in fact, the story begins in 1725 when James Otis Jr. was born. He was born to a well-to-do family. His father eventually became very influential in Massachusetts public affairs. He was colonel of the militia, and he prepared or intended his son to go to Harvard, which he did. Once he graduated, he decided to study law. And in those days, to become a lawyer, you studied in a lawyer's office. He attained his lawyer's license, so to speak, and went down to Plymouth to practice. But Plymouth wasn't big enough for James Otis Jr. He returned to Boston and began a very lucrative law practice. And as I indicated, the Crown appointed him Advocate General of the Vice Admiralty Court. And he was well known throughout the province. When the merchants of Boston decided to challenge these writs of assistance, they retained James Otis. He resigned his position with the Vice Admiralty Court and took their case without charging a fee. He declared, "In such a case, I despise fees." The only record we have of his 4-hour debate is the notes taken by John Adams. John Adams was a young lawyer, and he was in the audience and tried to take copious notes. Otis raised the common complaints that we're all familiar with: no taxation without representation, and a man's home is his castle, and so forth. After the fiery 4-hour debate, John Adams said every man in that audience was ready to take up arms. Said something profound had changed, and Adams declared that then and there, the child independence was born. And it wasn't long before there wasn't another name in the colonies that was better known than James Otis, except for Ben Franklin. The British thought he was the most evil man ever born. He continued his campaign against the oppressive British procedures to gain taxes, and he wrote pamphlets, he wrote circular letters, and so forth. He took particular aim at customs officials. One custom official was named Robinson. Sure enough, one night in a coffee house they met. An argument developed, and before long it turned into fisticuffs. Robinson struck Otis on the head severely with a cane and severely injured Otis. He was never the same after that. His physical health deteriorated and his mental health spiraled on downward, and he began to leave the scene. He was really the intellectual leader of the independence movement in the New England area. But because of these disabilities, he slowly moved out of the scene. He became very despondent, and he had his good days and his bad days. One of his bad days, he burned all of his private papers. That's one reason we don't have a modern biography of the man. There's very little to go on. He was placed in homes. In those days, people with a large enough home, they would take in somebody who needed that kind of attention. He wasn't a danger to anybody else, just to himself. He, at one point, was so despondent, he wished that a bolt of lightning would strike him dead. And he took up his time, however, tutoring. He tutored young kids. He enjoyed doing that. He came down to West Barnstable from time to time. One of the homes he was in Weymouth. He eventually wound up in a home in Danvers. And it was this week in May of 1783, a beautiful spring day, and all of a sudden a single clap of lightning came out of the sky, hit the chimney, and he was leaning up against the door frame, and the electricity passed to the door frame and struck him dead. And he had made his impression, however, and other people took up the cause. One of the people who took up his cause was his younger sister, Mercy. Mercy Otis hasn't been given over the years the credit that she deserves. It's only in recent years that we've begun to learn things about her. For example, in 1899, the West Barnstable Grade School had a pageant to end the school year, and they celebrated famous people from West Barnstable. They celebrated Lemuel Shaw, Mad Jack Percival, James Otis Jr., but no mention of Mercy. And in more recent years, Tracer's definitive history of Barnstable barely mentions Mercy. And I was privileged in 2001 to serve on a working group that eventually came up with the annual Mercy Otis Warren Cape Cod Woman of the Year award. And as we began, I thought I'd do a little more research on Mercy so we would be able to provide for the necessary publicity. And I contacted the National Women's Hall of Fame to see what they had to say about her. I was stunned. She wasn't in the Hall of Fame. So I asked the director, how does one get in? And she said, somebody has to nominate her. So I nominated her, and the next year, she made her way into the Hall of Fame. For that reason, I feel comfortable saying that Mercy Otis is the most important woman ever born on the Cape. And I feel safe saying that because there isn't another Cape woman who was in the hall. She had an extraordinary education for a young girl. Colonel Otis was self-taught. He appreciated education. He got the local minister, Reverend Jonathan Russell Jr., to tutor two of his boys, James Jr. and Joseph. But after a while, he noticed something. Every evening, when Jemmy, as they called him, came home, he would share his studies with his young sister. His sister was exceedingly interested in what her two brothers were doing. And the colonel also noticed another thing. Joseph wasn't a very good student. So Joseph went to work in the family store, and Mercy took his place in Reverend Russell's parlor. And she had a great interest in history, a sign of things to come. It was so much so that Reverend Russell loaned her his copy of Raleigh's History of the World. Eventually, Jemmy went to Harvard, and when he graduated, the family attended the ceremonies. And at that time, one of Jemmy's one of his closest friends at college was a youngster named James Warren. Warren was the son of a well-to-do Plymouth merchant. He got introduced to Mercy, and before long, romance developed, and eventually they got married. And once James Otis disappeared really from the stage, leading up to the Revolutionary War, as I indicated, others took the place. The Warrens, both of them, were quite active. Frequently there were meetings in their house, and people like Sam Adams, John Hancock, so forth would be in attendance. And they planned on how to advance their cause. And one thing that Mercy did, she began writing plays. She wrote 3 plays that poked fun at the British-appointed governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson. Effective. They were never enacted on the stage in puritanical Boston, but they're still in print. After the Boston Tea Party, John Adams asked her to write a poem promoting the Tea Party. She did, and she stressed the importance that women had in the Tea Party affair. It was probably her best poem. All the while, she began working on a history of the independence movement and the Revolutionary War. This was almost a lifelong process for her. After the war was over, the country was governed by what was known as the Articles of Confederation. But they were very deficient because they didn't unify the country. An individual state could make a treaty with another country without consulting with the other states. There wasn't a unified military. So a constitutional convention was called and a constitution drawn up. But the Warrens and many, many other people, famous people like Patrick Henry, John Hancock, were opposed to the Constitution because what it did, it said what the federal government could do, but it didn't say what the federal government could not do. And they thought it simply replaced one form of tyranny with another. So they pushed for a Bill of Rights, and a Massachusetts Compromise was enacted, and under the compromise, the opponents to the Constitution agreed to drop their opposition with a promise that a Bill of Rights would follow up. And that task was given to James Madison. He came forth with a number of amendments into the teens, and eventually 10 were adopted, and they became the Bill of Rights. All the while, Mercy was working on her book. As her eyes began to fail towards the end, one of her sons was a big help to her. The book came out, it was 2 volumes, in 1805. And it's considered a primary source of information about the move for independence and the Revolutionary War. The thing that's important about it, Mercy knew all the players. She knew everybody from Washington down through Hamilton, Hancock, you name it. And she had direct contact. That's why her publication is so valuable. She died in 1814 and is buried in Plymouth. At that time, another West Barnstable native was beginning to make a name for himself, John Percival. He was born on Scotton Hill in 1789. And I should say 1779. His family was mariners. His father was a sea captain, his grandfather was a sea captain, and it was only natural that he would go to sea. He went to sea at the age of 13. That seemed like a young age, but as a matter of fact, he was a little older than many Cape Cod boys. Many Cape Cod boys went to sea before they even got in their teens at that time. He was in the merchant service, and he had the misfortune to be off Portugal right after the British won a major victory in the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, and they were in great need of replacement sailors. The way the Royal Navy got their recruits in those days was through a system called impressment. It was no more than kidnapping. They would grab anybody off the streets that they could get their hands on, or they'd stop smaller vessels and take the seamen off the ship, and they'd become sailors for the Royal Navy. So John Percival got introduced to the naval service in that manner. Interestingly, his first ship for the British was the HMS Victory. The HMS Victory is a national shrine in England. It's considered the oldest warship in the world. Percival's last ship, which I'll talk about in a moment, was Old Ironsides. It's the oldest warship afloat, and it too is a national shrine. It's kind of interesting that his first and last ships are so important in the history of naval warfare. Nonetheless, he was transferred off the Victory rather quickly to serve on a prize vessel, and the discipline on the smaller vessel was poor. He was able to escape. But once he got back to America, he thought he kind of liked the naval service, and he went into the U.S. Navy as a master's mate, served in the quasi-war with France. The quasi-war with France was a naval war, not well known to most people. It didn't amount to that much. Once it was over in 1801, the Navy Department demobilized, as is the custom in this country to demobilize after a war, and Percival was discharged. The way they made a decision on that, they evaluated the ships. Percival was on the USS Delaware, a converted merchant ship, and the Navy didn't want it, so they scrapped the Delaware, and anybody on board that ship was gone too. So he was in the merchant service again. By 1809, as the War of 1812 was approaching, Jefferson enacted an embargo on American shipping, and it was almost impossible for the merchant service to survive. So Percival had an out. He went back into the Navy, this time as a sailing master. He rapidly made a name for himself. On July 4th, 1813, through a ruse, he was able to capture a British tender off of New York City. The tender was a smaller vessel that tended to the larger vessels that were blockading the port. And it was quite a victory to capture this ship. He towed it into the battery on the 4th, where there was a large crowd celebrating the Independence Day. This led Alton Blackington, who some of you may be familiar with. he was a folklorist some years back. He opined that Percival knew how to celebrate the 4th without listening to a band concert. He went on from there to gain some fame in serving as a sailing master on the USS Peacock. In fact, he was awarded a sword by Congress for his gallantry, and he was promoted to lieutenant, made his way after the war to the Boston Navy Yard, and came under the influence of Commodore Isaac Hull. By 1826, he was with Hull off the western coast of South America, and Hull got word that 2 years previous, the Nantucket whaleship Globe was the subject of a mutiny. The Globe was taken over by mutineers. It took that long for word to get from the mutiny back to Nantucket, and Nantucket to complain to Washington, and Washington to get instructions to Hull. 2 years had passed, and Percival was sent out into the uncharted waters of the South Pacific to see what he could find, to see what he could do about it. Miraculously, he found 2 surviving members of the Globe. They were innocent teenagers that had been carried away with the mutineers. The mutineers wound up killing one another or being killed by the natives. At any event, this incident is the subject of a number of books. It's quite a detective story, you might say. But his mission was only half over. Hull told him he had to stop off in the Sandwich Isles on the way back, Sandwich Isles being Hawaii. He, in the Dolphin, was the first U.S. Navy ship to visit Hawaii. And when he got there, he found a great deal of unrest. What had happened, the American Board, a Congregational Missionary Society out of Park Street Church in Boston, had been there for some time, and they were interfering in civic affairs. And they became a great influence on the king and on the government of Hawaii. Percival talked to Reverend Hiram Bingham, who was the leader, and told him he thought Bingham ought to stick to the gospel and leave the government to the local officials. One thing that caused a great deal of concern among the visiting seamen was for many, many years, the young ladies of Hawaii were allowed to swim out to the visiting ships. Bingham had the king put an end to that. It didn't sit well with the sailors in port. In fact, when Percival was there, some of them rioted. They chased Bingham into his house, threw stones through his windows and whatnot. And this led the king to say, geez, maybe I better change things. So he rescinded the order, and the young ladies were allowed to swim out to the ships. Percival in the schooner Dolphin left Hawaii on May 11th. To this day, the U.S. Navy Destroyer Squadron in Pearl Harbor celebrates May 11th as Mad Jack Percival Day. From there, he followed Hull into the Mediterranean. He was on board he had the USS Cyane, and Hull had the Ohio. In 1 week, they left from one port, headed to another in Sicily. And when the small squadron got into port, they noticed that Percival was already there in the Cyane. And that wasn't good manners. But Percival left his ship, went aboard the Ohio to pay his respect to Hull, and Hull immediately lit into him and says, "What's the idea of forging ahead like that?" Percival says, "You know what? You give me the Ohio on the return trip, you take the Cyane, and I'll still beat you." And Hull mellowed and says, "Yes, I know you will, Jack, because you're the best sailor I've ever seen." And that was one of the reputations he had. He had the reputation of being a highly skilled sailor. He also was known as a firm disciplinarian. The way the officer corps was set up in those days, a youngster in his teens, early teens, would be appointed an acting midshipman and work his way up through the ranks. When they were on board ship as an acting midshipman, they were required to study. There was a professor on most of the ships, and they were taught navigation and that kind of thing. Almost all of the midshipmen were sons of connected people, naval officers, members of Congress, wealthy merchants or whatnot. But very, very frequently, they asked the Secretary of Navy to make sure that their boy was assigned to Mad Jack Percival. And he kept them to his studies, much more than most of the other captains did. And it paid off. One good example, there was a youngster named Gustavus Fox. He was constantly feuding with Percival over the question of discipline, but it paid off. He went on to become Abraham Lincoln's primary advisor for naval affairs during the Civil War, and he was an admiral. There are other cases like that. And Percival has become the subject of many authors. Michener based a key character in his book Hawaii on Mad Jack. Hawthorne wrote about him, called him the pattern of old integrity. And Herman Melville even patterned a primary character in his book White Jacket. And the character, of course, was named Lieutenant Mad Jack. He describes his fictional Mad Jack, which was really a good description of the actual man. And he said that the sailors would prefer to take 50 watches under Mad Jack than one under a Rosewater sailor. Rosewater is a derogatory term meaning incompetence. He also pointed out that the men loved him all around despite his strict discipline. They tell the story of one time a sailor went into town, got drunk, and into trouble. Brought back, and the standard punishment for that kind of thing was 5 lashes of the cat o' nine tail. As he was being prepared for the punishment, he turned and said, "Captain, spare me. I'm from your hometown, Barnstable." Percival roared, "You rascal, you'll get 5 more for disgracing the place." His reputation was such that it won him a coveted assignment. In 1843, Old Ironsides was rotting in Norfolk. It was serving as a floating barracks. And the Secretary of Navy, David Henshaw, had a problem. He asked the naval contractor to estimate what it would cost to make the ship seaworthy. He came back with an estimate of $70,000. Henshaw had a problem. He didn't have the $70,000, but he was from Massachusetts, and he knew of Percival. He knew Percival, knew his way around vessels, and also Percival had a great reputation for being frugal. Called him down to Norfolk. Percival reported, "I can do it for $10,000. And Henshaw says, "If you can, it's yours." He did it for $10,000, and he took the ship on its only around-the-world cruise. And this around-the-world cruise is also the subject of several books, and any book on Old Ironsides mentions this circumnavigation of the world. It was quite a story, and I could talk at length on it, on the anecdotes and so forth that come up, but I'll just present one. When he was in Madagascar, you have to remember, he was 65 at the time. He was in relatively poor health. He didn't think he was going to make it back. And he noticed when he was on shore a huge log, and he instructed the carpenter to board ship and make a casket for him so he could be carried home if he died en route. And the way they would do it, they would fill the casket full of some type of spirits, brandy or rum, and it would preserve the body. And that technique was used when Lord Nelson was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar, and he was carried back to England in a long box full of rum. However, being the Yankee that he was, Percival didn't need as it turned out, he didn't need the casket, but he filled it full of exotic teas, silks, and so forth as gifts for all the people at home. But to further prove that he was a frugal old Yankee, he placed it out front of his home in Dorchester on Meeting House Hill to serve as a watering trough. After this notable assignment, he effectively retired from the Navy. But one of his friends was also making a name for himself, and that was Lemuel Shaw. They were boyhood friends in West Barnstable and lifelong friends. And that was a connection with Melville. Melville knew Percival quite well, and I'll get into how he knew him in just a moment. Shaw was born on Church Street in West Barnstable in the old parsonage. His father was a minister. All the men in the family over generations had been ministers. And Shaw was prepared for Harvard. It's interesting, he failed to get in on his first application. But on the second try, he got in and he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. But he didn't want to be a minister, even though it was thought that he would follow the family tradition. He remembered his father struggling to meet ends on the meager pay of a minister. So he went into the law. He studied law in the law office in Boston. The lawyer moved to New Hampshire, so Shaw followed him. And while in New Hampshire, he dabbled in journalism. And he met a young lady named Nancy Melville. Romance ensued, and before long, they were engaged. Unfortunately, she died shortly thereafter. And it is said that Lemuel carried on his person 2 letters from her for the rest of his life. It was 16 years before he became romantically involved again. In the meantime, he achieved a great deal of success in the law field, and he became very active in Federalist civic affairs and politics in Boston, became well known. In 1830, the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court dropped dead suddenly, and Governor Levi Lincoln needed a replacement. He quickly thought of Shaw, and Shaw rejected the offer, saying he would not take the job for a paltry sum of $3,000 a year. He, again, remembering that how his father struggled to meet ends. But Levi Lincoln wasn't defeated that easily. He enlisted Daniel Webster to plead his case. And Daniel Webster tried but was rejected. Webster tried a second time. He got an appointment with Shaw at his house, and they met in Shaw's study. Webster said he pleaded and cajoled, and all the while, Shaw was smoking cigar after cigar. By the end of their meeting, Webster said he could hardly see Shaw through the cloud of smoke. Once he left, Shaw did what a good lawyer would do. He prepared a brief, the positive reasons on one side, the negative on the other. He wound up accepting the job. He became probably, I shouldn't say probably, he was one of the outstanding jurists in American history. He's considered to have done for the common law what Marshall did for the constitutional law. This was partly because corporations were just beginning to develop at that time. Railroads were coming into their own, and there were all kinds of cases involving them. Slavery was another issue that he ruled on. He even presided over murder cases. At that time, the Supreme Court was a trial court also. A famous case involving a murder at Harvard, his charge to the jury to this day is used as an example of how to charge a jury. I mentioned he got romantically involved 16 years after Nancy died. He married a woman named Elizabeth Knapp, and they had 2 children, one a girl named Elizabeth. Unfortunately, his wife died at the end of 4 years, only a 4-year marriage. But they had the 2 children, and Elizabeth married Herman Melville, and that's a connection with Percival. Captain and Mrs. Percival often escorted Elizabeth Melville, the farmer Elizabeth Shaw, to the theater and so forth when Herman was out on the high seas gaining material for his books. And that was a connection. Interestingly, Herman Melville was the nephew of Nancy Melville, Lemuel's first love. He retired in 1860 after serving 30 years and establishing a tremendous record on the bench. He was considered fairly gruff. 2 lawyers were in a museum, Boston Museum, and they noticed a statue of a lion, and one lawyer said to the other, "Oh, that's a perfect impression of the Chief Justice." Ben Butler was a well-known lawyer in Boston, well-known in civic affairs. One day he got off the train leading a huge placid mastiff, and a friend of his saw him on the street and says, "Ben, is that your dog?" "Yes, it is." "Where are you taking him?" "I'm taking him down to the Supreme Court to put him before the Chief Justice so as to teach him to growl." 2 weeks later, after Shaw had handed down a ruling favoring Butler, they met on the street, and Shaw had a sense of humor. He said to Butler, "How did you like that last growl?" Shaw died in 1861, a year before Percival, and that brought an end to this quartet of fairly significant people. One, Otis, was, in my mind, a forgotten founding father. Mercy Otis Warren was an early feminist and one of the very first women to be a writer in this country. Mad Jack Percival was he rose to the top of the U.S. Navy. Captain was the highest rank when he was in, and he helped form the new Navy. Lemuel Shaw, as I indicated, is highly regarded as one of the great jurists in this country's history. And I think it's significant that in this 55-year period that they were married, that they were born in, the village of West Barnstable, I'm speaking only of the village, not the town, the village population could not be over 500. I don't think it was even 500. But to produce 4 people like this, I think is a pretty outstanding record. And with that, I'd be glad to open it up to questions. Yes, sir.
Correct me if I've got this wrong, but you said that Jack Percival was on HMS Victory.
Yes.
Which is great. Then he ends up on Einstein. And that seemed very unique to me. But did that happen a lot? Like people be on different ships in different countries?
No, he had the misfortune of being impressed, and that was, yeah. Right. No, it's just a odd coincidence. Yep.
Would you mind repeating the questions?
Oh, sure. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to Robinson? Was he prosecuted?
Otis sued him and collected but Robinson felt it was best for him to get back to England, and he did. Yes, sir, in the corner.
Was James Warren in relation to Joseph Warren?
They were distantly related, yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
How did Mad Jack get his nickname?
I'm glad you asked that question. At that time, many military officers had nicknames. I think probably the most famous one, well-known, is Stonewall Jackson. Very few people, I think, realize that his given name was Thomas, but many of them had names like that. It was because of his intense command while the ship was underway, and no-nonsense command. He took pleasure in the nickname, and it wasn't an insult or anything like that, but it was quite descriptive of him when he was underway. Other than that, he was very considerate, and in fact quite gentle. To give just one example, and you wouldn't find it, I'll give you two examples, you wouldn't find it of other officers. The young midshipmen all wanted to go into town one time when he was in Italy, and in order to accommodate them, the captain, he stood watch, which it just doesn't happen. He stood watch for one of the midshipmen so they all could go in. On another instance like that, and it happened more than once, on the Constitution, a seaman became fatally ill with tuberculosis. That man spent his last days in Percival's cabin. Yes, sir.
Is Mad Jack buried in West Barnstable?
Yes, he's the only one of the four who was buried in West Barnstable. His grave is right along Route 6A, just opposite Navigation Lane. And the town, during the 300th anniversary, put in a big granite plaque in the stone wall there, which in front of the grave site. Yes?
Regarding Mad Jack's May 11th imprisonment in Hawaii, was that against King Kamehameha, and was it in 1819?
No, he was there in 1826. Yeah, just for several months in 1826.
Do you know who was King Kamehameha?
I think you're right. I think that was the name. Yes. Yes, sir.
So where was Mad Jack born? You mentioned it.
He was born on the south side of Scotland Hill. If you're familiar with that area off of High Street, modern developers put in a road there, and they call it Percival Drive. That's quite close to where his house was. The only house of one of the four that is still standing is the Shaw homestead on 410 Church Street. That's where Lemuel Shaw was born. The Otis house was eventually torn down in the mid-1800s. And Percival's house long since disappeared, too. Anything else?
I just got one thing. You never plugged the best book ever written about the War of 1812. You know the title of it?
I know the title of one of them.
Yeah, Roman and Unhappy War
Yes.
by you.
Yes. Thank you for the plug. I might point out, if you're that interested, I've got another book coming out scheduled for publication July 31st. And the title is Myths, Half-Truths, and Tall Tales of Cape Cod.
Please join us for some desserts.
Yeah.
So you have to come in and have dessert.